Welcome to this episode of the Fig Files. I am your host and fig pig, Stephen Biggs. This is all about how to grow figs and harvest figs in a cold climate. Are you looking for an easy way to propagate your fig trees? If so, you might be interested in air layering, and that is what we will be talking about today. With air layering, what we're doing is getting roots to grow on a fig branch that is above ground. And think of putting a big soil-filled bandage around a branch. And what happens is where that branch is in contact with the soil, roots will grow and you can then cut it off and you have a new plant. So that is air layering. What I love about air layering is that it's a pretty hands-off way to propagate. If you've propagated by cutting, you know that you have to water regularly and you're trying to avoid getting pests like fungus gnats in there. Fungus gnats are the bane of fig growers trying to propagate through cuttings. But with air layering, you don't have to worry about that. So it's beautifully simple. The downside to air layering, if you'll call it that, is that you just won't be able to propagate as many plants. So with cuttings, you can cut a branch up into a bunch of fairly small pieces and make quite a few plants. So cuttings are great if you're sharing with friends, if you're trading, if you're trying to make lots and lots of plants for yourself. But air layering is beautiful because it is really, really simple. Start the air layer early in the season. And the reason that you want an early start as opposed to a late start is that if that air layer and some fragile little roots are on there over cold winter conditions, either really cold or drying out can cause the roots to die. So our goal is to have this air layer finished and potted up as its own plant before winter arrives. So that means we're usually starting in the spring or the early summer. When it comes to choosing which branches to do an air layer on, we avoid green branches from the current year. They're more likely to rot. So you're going to pick branches that are from the previous year or even older than that. I like year-old branches because I find they root the quickest. But I've seen people do an air layer down near the base of old plants because they want to make 2 or 3 plants that are a little bit shorter. So you can absolutely apply this method to older parts of your fig tree as well. When it comes to supplies, one of the great things about air layering is that you really don't need a lot. So you'll need some potting soil. Pick a soilless potting mix. You'll need something to wrap around there. Remember, I was likening an air layer to a bandage. So something to wrap around that potting soil to hold it into contact with your fig branch. And that could be, I've seen people slit water bottles lengthwise and then fit that around the fig tree and fill it with potting soil. I've seen people use sandwich bags. There are also purpose-made gizmos that you can buy for this. You'll pay an arm and a leg, so there's no need to do that. Some people will just use cling wrap. So use your imagination. I'm sure you'll have something around your place that you can use for this. And in addition to whatever forms that Band-Aid part and the moist soil that goes inside, you also need something just to tie it off. That could be twine, it could be electrical tape, could be a fastener like a zip tie. And which one you pick will depend on what you use to make that wrap, to make that Band-Aid. You might come across the advice to use rooting hormone when you're doing an air layer. And you can do that, absolutely. A lot of people do use rooting hormone, but the thing with figs is that they root very easily. So I personally don't recommend using rooting hormone when you're doing an air layer. You can think of a fig branch kind of like a chia pet. It is just waiting to send out all sorts of roots. So you can skip the rooting hormone if you don't have any around. So let's work through some of the steps here quickly. The first thing you'll do is pick a branch. I like to look for a branch that's fairly straight because it makes it easier to put that Band-Aid around it. So not something that's got a big kink in it. Pick something that's fairly straight and then remove any leaves that are in the way of where you'll be wrapping. And you can then position your wrap, whether that's the water bottle, whether it's a sandwich bag, position it around the branch and tie off the one end or fasten the one end and then start filling it with your soil. And after you've filled it with soil, then you can fasten the other end. So really, that's it in a nutshell. Now, some things to think about. First of all, with the soil, it has to be moist, so it can't be really dry, but you don't want it so that it's dripping wet. So what I usually do is I wet the soil well, but then I'll just squeeze it out with my hands before packing it into that big Band-Aid. So moist but not dripping wet is the way to think about this. And one other thing you might come across is the idea of girdling the branch that you're using the air layer on, or even slitting it. Sometimes people will do a fairly long slit along the length of the branch, cutting it even more than halfway through the width of the branch. So, in air layering, girdling or making some kind of wound like this is a very traditional technique and very important with some species. But back to what I was saying about figs kind of being like chia pets, they're just waiting to send out roots. You'll find that whether you do this or not, your fig air layer will root very well with or without that wound. So you've made your fig air layer. It's that simple. What you'll do is over the next, it's more than a month, 4, 6, up to 8 weeks. It'll really depend on the growing season and your fig tree, but you'll find that it'll root probably within a month. You'll start to get some nice little roots growing within there. And if you've used something clear for your Band-Aid, like a clear water bottle or a sandwich bag, you'll see those little roots growing. So it's neat. You can see the progress. And once it has rooted well, then you can detach it from the plant. So once you see a nice mass of roots in there, you can just cut that branch right below the air layer. You can remove that bandage and pot it up. Now, remember, we've just cut this branch off from the plant. So we've created stress for that new plant that we've rooted. And what I recommend is that you put your newly potted air layer somewhere that's shady for the first little while until it just gets over that stress. You can also cut some of the leaves that are on there, cut off half of the leaf. And in doing so, you'll get less moisture loss from that delicate, still new little plant. There's a quick introduction to air layering fig trees, a very useful technique for propagating fig plants, very easy and different ways you can do it. So I was talking about the different possible supplies. Some people girdle, some don't, some use rooting hormones, some don't. One other thing I should mention too is that some people will wrap tinfoil or something around any of the clear bandage-like products, whether that's a sandwich bag or cling wrap, with the idea of keeping the sun out of that root area and preventing it from drying as quickly. You can choose to do that. I've found that where I've air layered, those are branches that are within the canopy of the tree, so it hasn't been necessary. So that's another optional thing. And I point this out because, like many things in gardening, there are a lot of different ways that you can do this. So there's not always a right or wrong, but there's many different possible ways. So there's a quick introduction to air layering, a very useful method for propagating fig trees. We'll talk about rooting from cuttings in a future video. If this idea of air layering interests you and you'd like a little bit more detail about it, we have a whole article about how to air layer fig trees at the Food Garden Life website, and that's at foodgardenlife.com. See you in the next fig video. For more tips and ideas about how to grow and harvest figs in cold climates, head over to foodgardenlife.com. There's a whole library of articles and interviews with experts and a free ebook all about growing figs in cold climates. foodgardenlife.com.